Right, good evening everyone. Thank you for coming along. So this is a second expedition of Manchester Salon into New Mills. And it's one of my favourite venues in New Mills, which is why I wanted to try and have a public discussion here. It's part of the New Mills Festival, 2 weeks of activity around arts, but kind of creative things more generally, that we'll be finishing off with a lantern procession that New Mills is very well known for. People do come from miles around. One of the organisers of the New Mills Festival and New Mills Arts Fest, I had a bit of a row with her, or a bit of a disagreement, over the whole issue of signage of pieces of art around New Mills, and whether they should be labelled up, whether there should be a story about them, explaining either what the piece of art was all about, or who did it, why they did it, and what techniques they used maybe. And her response was that it kind of prejudges the audience, and it prejudges the discussion that an audience is going to have around the piece of art, which I wasn't very satisfied with, and it left me thinking, well, I don't really know enough about art in order to be able to make all those judgments, so I'd like a little bit of help with it. But the whole issue of the role of a curator came up, and the importance of a curator both in deciding and discriminating, making the judgment of what pieces of art get shown in the first place, and then once that decision has been made, how the conversation is then relayed to the audience, and how the audience could probably better experience that piece of art. Both Wendy and Pauline I've known before through helping to organise the Battle of Ideas, and they kind of set me straight a little bit on some of those views, and kind of said, well, actually, you don't want spoon feeding as an audience, so you're a bit wrong. Ideas that I kind of appreciate and judge. And Sarah was, do you prefer Sarah or Sarah? Sarah was proposed to me from some review work that I do for the Manchester Salon website on pieces of art and film, particularly at the Corner House. And as the Corner House has a big reputation for innovative, thoughtful pieces of art, it's a perfect fit to have out the discussion about the important role of the curator. So hopefully tonight it'll become a lot clearer for me, but it will also become a lot clearer for everyone else. So this is my first, and the salon's first step into the importance of the curator. Do you three want to introduce yourself briefly first, just say who you are, what your background is, and then introductions to get us thinking about it?
Yeah, sure, yeah. I'm Sarah Perks. I have a lot of titles, sorry, bear with me. Artistic Director at Corner House at the moment, which means in charge of film, visual art and engagement, so everything creative that happens at Corner House. But as a lot of you know, we are moving to a new building next spring called Home, which is a brand new purpose-built contemporary art centre, and we have visual art, film and theatre. So the building itself houses 2 theatres, a large ground floor gallery and 5 cinema screens, but we also have a big focus on commissioning new work, production and international work. And I'm also a Professor of Visual Art at the Manchester School of Art. But basically I've been a curator for about the last 6 years now. I do a lot of curation, production and whatever it entails to make new work and make commissions happen and bring it to audiences.
Pauline?
Right, I'm Pauline Hadaway, and I've worked in the arts and theatre and visual arts for a long time. And I was recently the director of Belfast Exposed Photography, which is a gallery of contemporary photography in Belfast. And I guess myself and our curator, senior curator Karen Downey, we kind of set the project up and created this very successful contemporary photography project there. And I now moved back to England. I'm at Manchester University, where I'm researching and studying, doing a PhD, and I'm working as a independent arts consultant. I hate that word, but I think that's what I'm doing. And at the moment I'm working with Cavan Arts back in Ireland, developing have been working with them developing a European Culture Europe bid. And yeah, I think that's enough for now. That's me.
Strong pedigrees, Wendy.
Yeah, my name's Wendy Earle, and my background's mainly in education. I worked in publishing for a while, education publishing, and then moved to the British Film Institute, where I was involved in the education team and got working with curators and got very interested in the problem of archives in particular and public engagement in relation to particularly young people. And I now work at the Birkbeck, and I'm Impact Development Officer, so I work with researchers to develop public engagement and stakeholder engagement with their research. And I did a PhD. In between those things, I did a PhD on museums, technology and cultural policy. I can tell you a lot about it, but I think you don't want to hear.
Well, we'll hear some of it. Public engagement is the real thing that I'm trying to understand in terms of the role of the curator. Public engagement is going to be part of this salon. But to get us thinking, do you want to introduce some themes and thoughts around the whole issue?
Yeah, thinking about engagement, I mean, that's my background. So what I should have said before becoming the artistic director, I was the engagement director. I'm particularly specialised in film and connecting young audiences or any audiences actually to film. So I think one of the key issues that I've always dealt with throughout the work I've done is that engagement can't be separated from curation or from the work that I'm doing. So it's always been thinking about audiences and artists and whatever medium I'm dealing with at the same time. And I think there's been a turn towards this for a number of years in museums and almost an obsession, whether that's around the instrumental or the intrinsic values of the collection, the art or whatever the museum is showcasing. There's been a sort of frenzy, if you like, to engage as many people as possible and to engage communities or different groups of people that weren't hitherto apparently in the museum. Which I think is really, really interesting. And now I guess we've moved on a little bit from that sort of the real kind of social impact, new labour approach, I sometimes call it, that we can look at it slightly differently and be a bit more sophisticated about our understanding of audiences in their widest sense and who comes. So I think my main sort of thing to come back to or discuss at any point is this idea of how we engage different people in museums or art galleries or cultural venues, and why for me the problem is always the focus on difference. So it's an assumption that these audiences aren't coming and in some way they are different or need something different to bring them in to the organisation. When I think actually what the work I've been doing in particular with artists focuses on what is similar, what connects audiences, what brings a diverse people together in a kind of positive experience looking at the art, not what singles them out as different in any context. Is that a good start?
I would come in on that then and add, because Sarah, your starting point is the sort of post-New Labour, more nuanced understanding of what an audience is and what engagement is. And the research that I'm doing at the moment, I said I was at the University of Manchester researching, and I'm looking at I'm looking at the sort of historical context, and I'm looking at going back to review those years, the what you might call the kind of New Labour awakening of interest in the arts. And I've got a particular interest, having worked in Belfast for many years, at that particular, if you like, the particular form it took in different parts of different regions, and particularly in Belfast, where the New Labour project became about using the arts as a way of driving all sorts of different political agendas, which you might not have thought were connected to the arts, including, you know, social and economic reconstruction of the city and peace building. And I'm interested in that because there's a sort of a difficult fit between peace building in a society where it's actually very fractured and where you have problems of difference that can't be resolved. And so to apply a model which is the, I think what we might call then for shorthand, the New Labour model, if you like, of accentuating diversity and difference and celebrating it in Northern Ireland raises all sorts of very difficult and quite interesting questions arose from that. So that's my research area. What I'm interested in is the, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that, and you know, my experience of working, particularly seeing younger artists and younger curators coming up out of art college and establishing themselves, was that what I really was very, very clear was people were searching for a new kind of language to talk about community. The sort of, again, shorthand, New Labour speak was becoming very tired and very sort of just worn out feel to it. And it didn't seem to reflect either what people experienced or what they aspired to. But nevertheless, my thesis is that it has made a huge impact on you know, how we all who work in the arts and how audiences who go to galleries or go to museums, what they are actually experiencing, I would say now is markedly different from what they were experiencing when I started working in the arts. Now that's obviously a good thing because obviously you want things to change. But in some ways I think my problem is that in some ways that it has changed in a negative way. And in particular, and I'm going to really, I'd like to sort of introduce the idea of the curator working in the museum, as although I actually come from, you know, a gallery background myself, I'm researching around the museum, because what I've seen emerging is museums without collections, the new kind of museum that is a really kind of a fluid sort of empty space in many ways, where the relationship really is between the museum and the visitor, and the curator has literally been written out of the picture. To a large extent, either their job has been redefined or they have been moved. In some museums, they've actually moved them off-site, so they're not actually in the museum any longer. They're kind of consulted. And a particular instance, you know, that I'm looking at as a case study of the new kind of museum is a big museum that was built in Belfast to celebrate the Titanic. And I'm really interested in that because it ticks every box. It's celebrating, or rather commemorating something. It is a tourist draw. It's also tied into a peace building, set up a huge peace building agenda, trying to sort of rebuild a kind of urban memory or a link to the past for the East Belfast former shipyard community. But at the same time, it's capitalising rather opportunistically on a kind of worldwide fascination with Titanic. And it just embodies so many different agendas. But one thing it doesn't have is any clear kind of the exhibition or the site, which has a sort of industrial archaeology. It's set in the old shipyards. It's a shiny new signature building, but its location is the shipyards of Belfast. It's really fascinating. Rich in history, very conflicted history. And what the Heritage Centre does then is it draws on this huge historical and cultural legacy, but it just doesn't do anything interesting with it. And I think the reason it doesn't do anything interesting with it is because it hasn't called upon a curator. Now, it doesn't have a collection, but it does work with other collections. And my particular, with the photography background, my particular interest is what have they done to the film and the photography in this visitor centre or heritage centre or whatever it is, this new kind of museum. And I think what they've done with it is to take something that's very rich, something that is the photograph and the film is of historical interest because it is evidence of the city in 1912 when the ships were being built and when it was a major industrial city. They are full of visual evidence. You can see the sheer scale of the industry, the scale of the manufacturing, the small size of the little houses where the shipyard workers worked. You see the men coming out of the shipyards at the end of a shift. The collections are rich in themselves. They're drawn from the national collections. Some of them are work from the Welsh and Hogg collections, and these were photographers who were commissioned by the industrialists of Belfast to record the scale and grandeur.
Well, it sounds like what they've done is actually do a documentary rather than an art curation project.
They have.
And therefore, this debate, though, is looking at curation in particular,
Yes.
which means actually this case study you're presenting is isolated in its own right. So what would be nice to hear from you is exactly where do you fit in as in like the curational role?
I'd just like to and it'll take me just a minute to just run to the end of this, because my point is that the photographs, which I know are very rich and full of, not only are they historically interesting, but they are objects too, made by people of that time. And they have been presented in such a way that they that richness is obscured. So they are presented with Disney characters walking across them, and they are presented in a way that they become a sort of immersive experience, so that what you're doing is not actually looking at the photographs, you're not looking at them, and there's no direction or any guidance that could help you to understand how important these photographs are. They simply become part of an immersive experience so that they create a kind of almost theatrical impression of what it was like to be in Belfast at that time. So I'll finish there. So really what I'd like to talk about is what a curator who understands photography, who understands the history of photography, and who understands the importance and value of those photographs and that film could have brought to that exhibition, display and presentation, that what wasn't there that isn't there in the displays that have been put together by a professional or a corporate museum design company.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, okay, yes. I mean, I think that, I'm not a curator, and my interest is more from the kind of, as a member of the public, going to view, I'm specifically focusing here on galleries and museums, and how that has changed over the last couple of decades, I suppose. I mean, when I was sort of preparing for this, one of the things I was thinking about sort of like was my old job when I was working for a publishing company, Visual Resources Publishing. And one of my challenges was to go to museums and archives and try and find photographs to use in the publications that weren't the stock photographs that lots of other had already been used a lot of times. And I'd I'd go to British Museum or the National Maritime Museum, whatever, and you'd come across these curators who were more interested in their own research than yours, and were distinctly grumpy about your coming and making kind of demands as a publisher and as a non-specialist. But that kind of curator, I think, now has become, a sort of almost an extinct species, or has gone deeply into hiding, because the idea of a curator being grumpy and being interested in research is almost just unacceptable. Increasingly, there's a sort of sense that curators should be when they're starting out in thinking about a project, they're, primary, very high up in their list of priorities is thinking about public engagement and how do we engage the public in this. And I think there is a real tension there, because I think, a lot of curators are very specialist, they know their subject, they're very interested in their subject. But I know from working at BFI, there was this sort of sense that, this question that was always being asked, why are you wanting to put that stuff, make a priority of researching that stuff? What is interesting about it to the public? How are we going to engage the public in that? And certainly while I was in the BFI, there was a major shift from the prioritisation of the collections, the kind of focus on the collections, and in a way putting the collections up there for people to see. We'll put them up and they will come. To thinking about, how do we make them come? Which I think, the point you made early on is absolutely to the point. I think there was this frenzy of public engagement, and that has to some extent calmed down. But I think that it has left a very great mark on the whole process of curation. And I think the way I kind of seeing it, this is, I confess, it's a bit crude, but it's almost like there's two things that have happened, which is a kind of, on the one hand, a kind of over-curation, and on the other hand, a kind of abdication of curatorship. And that's the two things that I thought I kind of wanted to go into in a little bit more detail, because I think the way the over-curation comes in is a sort of the feeling that you have to put lots of labels, and the labels are quite wordy onto exhibits, that you have to kind of tell a story, that in a way the exhibits only hold together to the extent of the story that you can tell about them, and the individual and people will only relate to the individual objects if you can fit them into some kind of story that somehow has relevance to modern life. One of the, I don't know if any of you got down to see it, but an example of this in particular was one that got up my nose in particular was the Ice Age exhibition. Sort of, I think the Ice Age, the modern Ice Age art, and the origin of the modern mind, or something like that. And the curator there had a very explicit argument to make. And that argument is basically that, the modern mind, we can see the beginnings of the modern mind back, 3,000-4,000 years ago. And so that's sort of like, that we, therefore the relevance, the implication was the relevance of the objects today are, they're relevant to us understanding our modernity about how we exist. To me, that's an entirely contentious argument. And one might read it in a book, but I found it very intrusive going around the exhibition, feeling like I was having this argument made to me, when, you could look at those objects in very different ways. They would tell you lots and lots of different things. And the curator was telling you had one line that you would basically follow through. And I found that, as I say, quite intrusive. I think similarly, I don't know if people are familiar with Kelvin Grove in Glasgow, but that museum, is basically, the exhibits are built around this idea of telling people a kind of educational story, fitting the exhibits into some kind of story about the world in which we live now and understand the world in which we live now, rather than just looking at the exhibit and thinking about, what other stories can it tell us? How do we understand that? How do I understand that from my perspective? And that kind of thing. Insisting that our interest could only be there if it had some kind of identifiable relevance to the present and to our lives. I think the other side is the kind of more abdication. And I certainly this was exemplified in a project that I researched doing my PhD called Every Object Tells a Story, which was basically an online platform that was created at the V&A, where people were invited to put their objects online and tell their stories about them. And those were intended to have equal credibility to the kind of, the exhibits in the V&A, which had been carefully researched and had been carefully have been, have part of a very complex historical narrative. And I was looking, I don't know if people are aware of the Museums Association. It's basically the body that oversees the development of museums in this country. And they have a new policy which is called For the Future of Museums. And if you look at their website, you almost think, you sort of begin to wonder whether the museums have a future at all, in any sense that we have understood them in the past. Because I think, referring back to the points you're making, Pauline, basically the agenda there is every museum must play its part in improving lives, creating better places and helping to advance society. So museums must use their collections to this purpose. And if you go around their website, they have a number of kind of, suggested case studies recommending things that museums can do, which include, for example, setting up sewing circles, gardening, cultural exchange, and that kind of thing. And, the sort of like one of their examples, again, in Glasgow, is the Mungo Museum of Religious Art, where they invite over 100 people to come in and select their own objects from the collections and interpret them for themselves. And the curator steps back as the voice of authority, basically says, it's not me who knows all this stuff that's important. It's you who know your own particular thing that's important. And I think that expresses a real problem, where we have a kind of almost like a denigration of knowledge that museums historically have represented, that kind of development and understanding of, if you like, the human condition. And sort of turning it, in a way, sort of reducing the museum to a collection of individual experiences, and as if those individual experiences make up the whole, which I think is highly disputable. So I do think this is a really problematic development, and I think that's something that, it is there are complications there, because it's that there are issues to do with what will bring public into museums, how do museums get funded, how do they justify their funding, and all of that kind of thing. And there are real issues to be dealt with there. But almost at every event that I now attend, including a sort of a recent one last Thursday, to the extent collections themselves are talked about, they're talked about what can collections do for us, rather than the fact that those are their collections, which can, in a way, do many different things that are completely unprotectable, and the more we try and start to engineer what they can do for us, the more we kind of narrow down what they can actually, what they are, what they can offer. And so I think that's sort of like, I think what we're kind of in a way living through is a shift from museums being unique organisations which have a very particular role in society, which is very important because we value the knowledge and achievement that they represent, into kind of things that are more like community centres and social services and that sort of thing. And that is, I think, the extent that resources are being pushed in that direction. I think that's a very worrying development.
Thank you. Did you want to come back?
Yeah, I disagree with a lot of that in a sense. I love some museums, not others, but I think what you're describing is not different methods of curating, but often just bad curating. So whether the curator has abdicated themselves because of a lack of research or a lack of ability to present or a lack of ability to connect to audiences and people, I think that there can and has to be a balance of engaging people. I don't know why no one would set out to not have anyone in the museum. I think that's vital to whatever subject matter you're trying to present, whatever it is. But I think there's just really bad ways of delivering that. What you describe in Belfast, which doesn't sound new either. It sounds like do you remember the Viking Museum in York that I'm sure we all went to at some point? It's that kind of experience. There wasn't films and photographs, but you got in and you could, smell the Viking village and enjoy it in that way. But I also think, and you said about people telling stories. Some people would abdicate curation altogether in some kind of collaborative manner, or people would just tell at you the story or what's happening. But actually what's strange is that in developing our new programme strategy for home, we've talked about how actually it's constantly telling stories, whether that's theatre, visual art or film. But the point is who is telling the story. So if it's one person's view and you're telling it at people what the story means, you're telling the audience what to think, that's very unattractive. But if you're bringing in a multiple kind of lots of different voices and able to have people see different things in it and find their own stories within the work, and there's definitely context. I've done a lot of exhibitions that are about socio-political conflict or something where you just cannot not have the context in a sense. It's almost more dangerous to not kind of give people information about what's going on, but then you don't tell them what to think. They need spaces to be able to discuss and understand and engage through the different methods that they want to do that in, whether it's creative groups of some kind, practical activities, or just sit down in the bar and have a drink and have it out with the curator. So I think there's just a problem in terms of tradition with some museums being very traditional about the way that they perceive engagement. So it's a bit like this collection is for people, this activity is for people, and they don't engage people in how those activities should play out. There's also recently the intervention, usually by some cool, hip, contemporary artist, which I think just shows that the way museums are trying to think. They're like, we need some young people in. So Manchester Museum, Manchester Art Gallery is like in the middle of their very beautiful Pirath-like collection sticks a Banksy, and it just looks awful and it doesn't help, and I'm not sure who is going to engage with that or be impressed by it. So it comes back to this voice of authority that you mentioned, Wendy. Whose voice is it? Whose authority is it? And who owns that? But actually, conversely, I actually think although I work with a lot of people in a very collaborative program, bring in a lot of people, I'm not denying there is a voice of authority that is mine, that is in control in some ways, but allows a lot of other voices in, and also leads into the direct research I do at the university.
And I'll come to you in a second, and don't answer it directly. But for me, there is a broader lack of authority or loss of authority of a kind of natural way, and it does seem to be imposed in a very technical, often punitive kind of way. So how is that working out in terms of curation? Not necessarily at home, but more broadly across curators. And you kind of flag up a point, well, that's because there wasn't a curator there. But that, for me, is part of the process where curators, or the role of a curator, is being pushed to one side, but also where there are curators, and there does seem to be even more curators now than there ever was. People like me calling themselves curators of public discussion, curators of this, curators of all sorts. But in that sense, it loses the meaning, the historical meaning of authority. So it's a similar word, but represents a loss of authority. Now, I'm still a bit conflicted over this, telling the story and having a line and giving a context, because even more annoying than being told
But you can just tell them badly, that's the thing. You can tell the story, you can tell it badly. It's not the same as not having a curator.
But I really hate not even being told a story, not even being told context. It might be just that I fit and don't understand it.
I can come in on this, because I think that if it is example of bad curation, and there's a heck of a lot of it out there, because when you go to a museum, this is what I feel, when I go to a museum, I now expect the worst. I don't go to a museum with any great hopes of seeing what I want to see, which is actually to see whatever the museum, if it's natural history, or if it's history, or if it's heritage or local heritage, whatever it is, there's always a barrier. Not always, but there often is a barrier. And the barrier is that the museum, somebody's trying to either to tell something or to make some sort of statement or to get some sort of message across. And it seems to come between the visitor and the object of their interest. The object of their interest is often an object. And what's interesting to me about, say, something like the Titanic Centre is that they've just done away with the idea of having it's no collection. There's no substance to it. It is quite shallow and quite sort of. It's based on an idea of an interest in a mythical sort of history that's been almost made up, and it's a film anyway. And that so it
it's history as well. It's not just a film.
It is
actually real life. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of personal context that comes with going to the Titanic exhibition. I'm sorry.
What I would like to see when I go to a museum about the Titanic, you're right, is some kind of attention and respect paid to the fact that it isn't just
But that's
a piece of
but
fiction.
you're putting
I
also a
didn't say
personal
that.
spin on that, because people also go there for interest, entertainment. There is so much, using your particular vocabulary of richness, whatever that might entail. There's also a really considerable amount of entertainment, which is very, very valuable and adds a lot of additional value to how you bring people to something, to have what actually Sarah pointed out really well before, a commonality of things rather than driving things apart. And I would say, not having seen, I actually seen quite a lot of reviews about this exhibition you're commenting on, actually, that it's very similar to something that also our the War Museum does in Manchester, because every time I go there I go, what am I doing here, what am I getting? I do challenge it constantly, because I bring with me also, also putting in context. I used to be a curator for many years. I'm now senior manager at PlayStation. I work with a lot of IP development, a lot of public engagement as well there. I'm currently working on a board with the V&A to present one of the biggest video game history museums. So I'm part of the board there and dealing with the V&A, and it's not pretty, to be quite honest. So I speak with a little bit of kind of history to this as well. But actually having sometimes a storyboard that is about actually storytelling, having a story being told by someone puts you in a position where you can put your story in. It opens up dialogue. And I think dialogue, more than important, if you hear just one story, if you tell a kid a story, they will bring more stories to it. Oh, I experienced that, or I don't see that. Why is that so? You question something. And I do think something, those sort of experiential ideas, they're not necessarily immersive, I would say more experiential, go, oh, I saw the boat, I saw this. Very picturesque, more like a colouring in book, perhaps.
But I'm
can actually lead to some very, personal stories being taken away, which is part of a curational track.
What I'd like to ask though is, because there are people who, very accurate what you've asked, you're chairing this, but is to actually get some response from people who go to, museums and galleries. Because I think what you were saying there is fine, but that's a problem for me again, because you were talking actually as if an audience were children, and not all audiences are children, but people don't necessarily go to a museum to tell their story. They may go to a museum for the same reason they may read a book or go and see a
connection. That's what story is. It's connection. It's about purpose.
That's what I kind of would challenge, I suppose. I mean, I suppose it partly does mean what you mean by connection, and I think there's a tendency to assume in a lot of exhibitions, and I think that possibly what we're seeing is a rise of bad curating, because there is so much concern about how do we connect with the public, and so you're constantly trying to second guess what the public might be interested in, what might connect with them. But I think the thing about connection is there are sort of assumptions curators can make that can be completely wrong for a lot of members of the public. And to some extent, it is just, for me, going to a museum which displays the work in a very beautiful way and provides basic information on a label which says, the date and the place and the artist, or the, sort of like a very sort of, small amount of relevant information, so you can kind of connect it. You can connect it then with other objects that you've seen, not necessarily with your own experience, but maybe other objects that you've seen elsewhere, or other pictures that you've seen elsewhere. The more you go to museums and galleries, the more you gain in your own knowledge of what those museums and galleries are. So, you begin to sense of, you learn over time what an impressionist is, you learn over time what a sort of, what one particular artist's style is, if you like, or you learn what a Greek pot looks like, and what the range of Greek portraits are. And those are things that the more you go to museums, the more you look, the more you can connect up with each other. And that's a connection. But that kind of connection is almost like that connection of just looking at sort of like, collections and saying, actually that collection of Greek pottery amazes me, because it just goes to show what level of skill Greeks developed in making their pots. What possible relevance does that have to anybody's life? No connection, but it's still interesting learning the level of skill that's involved in there. Then you find out a little bit more about it. Either somebody tells you or reading a book, the difference between sort of, red and black and, foreground and background and all those various things that you kind of, can learn if you want to learn. And that gives you a greater appreciation of those Greek pots. But those Greek pots have got nothing to do with your life, except to the extent you're interested and curious about where they come from, and why they exist, and why people created them, and what level of skill they used in creating them.
I don't think it's about the red figure vases or in my case post-internet art or some kind of performance or failed to make a female rape revenge film. It's not about the actual things, it's just how they're presented. That's curation in a sense, apart from the looking after it side of things, which is important to preserve the archives and looking after historical artwork. It's just in the presentation for me and how museums create an atmosphere, how they create a place for people that they want to be in, that they want to experience, but also, and sometimes it doesn't have to be for everyone, this idea that you can do, let's take the arts council phrase, great art for everyone. It's impossible, it's a crazy setup. So fine, you have target audiences, you have strategies to expand audiences, to connect both who you might perceive as a regular audience and who you might perceive as a new audience to develop and grow. But I think it's certainly not about the red figure vases, it's simply the environment that they're in and how you can kind of, and also preserve some of the beauty of them without telling the stories or overdoing you need activities to understand this.
Sorry, I could just ask, because I'm dying to ask, but how you, with your knowledge and your, long and very sort of deep engagement with your subject, how do you communicate that? Do you feel you need to communicate what you know to the visitor who comes in, who probably knows very, very little, has a very sort of superficial knowledge? Do you feel it would be benefiting them if you were able to share your knowledge?
Yeah, I do. I talk to them constantly and feel it's a really important part of my role. So I do the gallery tours of the exhibitions, I do formal events and informal discussions with the audience. I don't see how I could, curate or direct such a large space with such a complicated program without being really close to the audience. But actually, moreover, the other side is I'm known as an artist curator. I work so closely with the artists, but that's basically about me bringing them together, not being left in a space in between. So there's a polarization of audiences and artists on either side. And how I find the best way to do it for most people is just to tell the story. So I describe what's happened. Actually, now more the artists take over and describe how they've worked with me, how we've gone on a sort of 3-year journey to produce the film or the installation or the performance. And so just by opening it out, by it not being a secret thing, and not always having the answers, I've done very specific historical and political work, but sometimes I can't remember when a particular date was in the, if I'm dealing with Palestine and Israel or something, you don't have to. You can look it up, you can call on people to join the debate, bring in not just experts either, but people at all different levels to talk about it and discuss it. So I guess for me, it's particularly just that careful balancing of the artists, the audiences, not making assumptions on the audience's behalf or assuming who the audience is, and not doing things for specific groups or pulling out specific people because I think they're going to be interested or I want them to be interested. It's trying to sort of cut across that. But of course
That's called good curation.
I think so. I think, and that's what, and I don't think it's particularly contemporary actually. I think it's something that good museums and galleries have always done. And I think there's probably, just a false expectation around engagement or particularly instrumental values that, I'm kind of horrified at the thought that a museum on the Titanic would, and I'm sure this was in the plans at some point, would create community cohesion or get kids more GCSEs or something like that. I think it's that's a mistake to try and do that.
See, for me, you sounded quite old school in terms of good curation, and I must admit, personally, I quite like older galleries. So the kind of pre-Raphaelite pictures and that kind of exhibition, I love all that. It's got a context, grandeur, it's set well, it's all the new stuff that I really find irritating and so lacking for me. So a question further, how do you measure the connection? And same question to you, really, because you were talking about how to think through and technically establish a relevant connection to an audience. But how do you measure that? Because
can I just add another
can,
question?
Could I just finish my question and then
okay.
It's
very closely related. Okay.
Because the way that you explain or describe the curated tours sound absolutely fabulous, and that's what really wound me up about all the pieces of art around New Mills. It was on a guided tour where it was all explained, and I just thought, why isn't this explained in a programme or at the side of all the pieces of art? Because this is absolutely the experience that I want. And so the same curator gave a fantastic guided tour, but didn't embed it. I mean, obviously she's very busy and everything like that, but ideally that would all be part of that.
I think it's a real...
So how do you kind of measure that? Because the way that you describe it, your board would just have to trust you, which is a great thing, a good thing, but it's a scary concept in the kind of new labour engagement thing.
No, but they have reams of feedback. Oh, sorry,
Do you want to?
Well, I'm just curious to know if the panellists could tell us what they think engagement actually means. So to me, it's more than just a connection. It's more than just having people come into a museum. You know, it's a very dynamic. I mean, I suppose it's like gears engaging, isn't it? So it relates to what you were saying. How do you measure it? But what is it that you would be trying to measure? I'm beginning to get a sense of how you would define it from the conversations you might have. But I'm wondering if you could each define what you mean by engagement.
In a second. Do you want to? Could you explain how you? Because you're setting out on this project with the DNA.
Yes.
How are you going to embed a measurement of connection if you're going to?
It's actually incredibly difficult, because actually what I really enjoyed about you setting the question actually, and actually building on that as well from you, is that when you looked at the sort of pre-Raphaelite exhibitions, we've got a rich history that we bring with us from very, very early on. It's a long history that we kind of adopt and build with us. So where more modern contemporary art, electronic media art is so new to us, we still often, despite the fact it might be already 50 years old, still don't really know how to open the windows and the doors to really kind of engage with it. And that will just take time, and that takes patience and, you know, trust as well, that you just said, trust in the curator as well, to present you with a story or a narrative or a question even, actually, because sometimes these spaces allow you to walk away, like you just explained. You saw someone doing a really good talk for you, and actually that catalyzed into this, which is amazing, because that is engagement. You actually took something and built something on it. So with the V&A, wanting to do a very big historical game exhibition, very cleverly, and Kieran Long, that some of you might know through a TV program, as part of our board. The discussion is, how do you actually open up an artwork in such a way that some of the processes are actually revealed, which actually comes back to crafting, which is very old traditional art making, when you talked about the pots before. What is the craft that sits behind making this artwork? So people essentially, okay, these are some of these quite hard words sometimes, learn while they're in a museum, enjoy while they're in a museum, or question. So, and these are really tough headliners to I guess, pull together very well in order to attract, for a museum like the V&A, new audience. And it's failing in my perspective at the moment, because with the beauty of what the museum is of the V&A, why people seek it out already because of historical family, because of its rich history, people go there anyway. It's just something that you see. suddenly you see a electronic game exhibition there, and they have to place it. So right now, without saying more, they're trying to be extremely controversial in presenting what this media art, this skill set is, in order to attract an audience that they think they don't have because they have to answer to the Arts Council, which Sarah picked out, engage all for, happy lives.
So I have a question building on from that, because I come from the funding side.
Yes.
How much are you as curators limited by the fact that you are beholden to the Arts Council?
Yes.
And therefore you have to create spaces that are about new audiences and engagement.
Yes.
Do you think about that, or does that not really deflect from your artistic vision too much? Or?
I think
And would it be good to get rid of all the funding?
Somebody's got to pay for absolutely.
No, they're all connected.
They're all
your question, what is engagement, is a great one. It's like,
yes.
what is digital? It's like, it's perfect. So then when you're answering back to the various funding bodies, you can make it what you want, because no one really knows, because it's a very
It's a vision.
wide,
it's a vision.
Yeah, it's a big wide phrase. What does engagement mean? I think it's just a good term to think about. A two-way relationship, that's all. That's what it is for me. Whether there might be a very hard relationship and not moving into more like participatory work that I've done a lot of, where people are making the art with the artist and myself. But actually just thinking of it as a two-way relationship rather than this is a presentation and you're a passive experience, audience member or something. And measurement, a perfect example. Because there are a lot of traditional measurements of success for funders, like number of people visiting, the press, kind of how much you would have had to pay for that kind of press. But also the way it goes beyond measuring and the way that you can kind of get through to funding bodies about changes in various artworks or audiences and structures is simply the reaction of the audience, and having, the audiences are quite vocal, the feedback, what does our board think? Well, they come to things in the building and they see everyone engaging, exciting, they see a diverse group of people. It's got to be that balance of qualitative and quantitative evaluation. And of course it's hard. There's so many times I'm asked, how do you know this is cutting edge international performance? How do you know this is amazing artist film? It's almost an impossible question in a sense, but you can rely back on a variety of different things, which you then use to kind of back up your further case for why things need to be pushed, in a sense, why things need to be explored. And there's sort of traditional ways of doing that. Maybe you do set off on a kind of research agenda to legitimise, in a sense, what you're doing that is very kind of controversial and contemporary. But that's fine as well. There's ways of doing it, but ultimately I think I don't mean audiences in terms of number, but you need a few people that can, and also social media is great for that now, so that can tweet and respond. And it's interesting, because I said it didn't matter what it was, but actually if it's new digital or media or technology, that's an interesting one. Been talking about an exhibition my friend is developing on very similar things on software, and it's very difficult to actually come up with an exhibition that's not very one-sided. Going back to that thing about engagement, it's like, how do you just not? And also there's pre-Raphaelite paintings, and then there's old style, attached to
engagement.
In a second.
I think the idea of engagement is entirely problematic, and I think the problem with the whole funding framework is it sort of tries to simplify it and tries to say that you can measure it or you can see it or whatever. And when I, first started at the BFI, you kind of knew when you were doing an event that it was engaging because of the way the audience responded. As soon as you had to start putting that down on paper, it completely deadened it. So that's one problem. The other problem, I think, is that engagement is a very personal thing. So, you'll pick up a book and you'll read it and you'll be engaged in it, but nobody can see that engagement and nobody can measure it. Only you can talk about it. And the bureaucratization of engagement has completely destroyed. I think it's a sort of it has had a real kind of impact on the way museums and at an organisational level, curators at more at an individual level, sort of feel that they're under pressure. I know academics, you sort of having to think about their impact of their research. You feel you're under a new kind of pressure that you don't quite know how to handle. And what you do in handling is that you simplify, and you kind of turn something that is very subtle and nuanced experience into something that's actually very crude and false, actually, sort of doesn't really tell the story. So I think I would really like to sort of have a campaign against the Arts Council or funders to destroy, to end this use of the word engagement, because I think it doesn't tell us. It's a complete hostage to fortune, if you like. It creates a complete hostage.
I'm tweeting you right now.
So that's one side of it, but I think the other problem is the sort of like, or what's happened in that process, or is part of the process, is what it is as a curator, what you kind of represent, and obviously that does vary from collection to collection or type of art form or whatever. And you obviously represent a huge amount of knowledge, and then if you're dealing with an audience, you will take a somewhat pedagogic approach. You will think about that audience, and you'll think about, well, what will make that audience pay attention to what I have to say and pick up and note what I have to say. And that's a sort of that kind of relationship of pedagogy to an audience is one thing. But I think something deeper is happening that worries me, and I think that kind of is what is represented by the Museums Association website, the future of museums, and museums change lives. And the fact that they can suggest that it's a good thing that a museum sets up a sewing circle, or that a museum allows people to come in and create an exhibition that, of items that are important to them. I mean, I recently went to St Mungo's Museum, and I was just, I was rather horrified by the superficiality of it all, and it wasn't that particular. St Mungo's in Glasgow. It's a religious art, and I find it incredibly superficial, because really it was taking a very kind of narrowly educational national curriculum type approach to the collection. Old national curriculum type approach, actually, as it happens. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of I think there's a problem that we've got to somehow grapple with and recognise that even, I'm not a curator, but even curators like yourself, or certainly the curator that I saw on Friday night at the National Gallery, so knowledgeable, so interesting to hear, so talking about an image, so, you're right, it does completely enliven that image. But there's a sort of, the attempt sometimes to condense it or to simplify it or to turn it into a straightforward narrative. I think that level of bad curation, as perhaps we would like to say, is on the increase. Not because people are bad curators, but because it's an expectation of what an exhibition should be, or what the audience can take on board. The audience can only take on board narrative. And the word narrative is another word I'd like to ban, actually, in relation to museums, because the narrative overtakes everything else about works of art. You have to have, why was this picture painted? What is it, who owned, all of these different things, when the picture itself actually has a pure aesthetic quality, and that kind of gets lost. And I think there's a sort of, I know I'm talking about a lot of very complicated things, and there's lots of issues to come into them, but there's something I think that's going wrong in the world of curation today that we need to kind of take on board and look at and examine and challenge a bit. And I think there are two of those areas in relation to engagement and narrative.
Do you think it's because what Susie brought up about funding, that a lot of project managers are propelled into curational roles, perhaps because the money for actually very thoughtful, visionary, strategic curators is actually not being valued enough, perhaps, in this contemporary space, to pay them to actually do what you're saying, and that, it's actually sort of a level of funding and support within the art centre.
I think it's deeper. The thing that worries me
even deeper. Okay, interesting.
I think the funding, in a sense, is a symptom of it. In a sense, the funding, the fact that if you are running an organisation and your funding is cut, that you would automatically say, well, let's cut the curatorial team, because we need another marketing person, or we've got to have more engagement, whatever that is, And I'd like to come back to engagement, because I think it is a very interesting question, because engagement, and I know this because I've developed projects, and I know exactly, worked in a highly political environment, and I know that when you use a word like engagement, it can mean, as you say, anything. It can mean anything, and that's the danger of it, because what politicians think it means is political engagement. That's what they want. The reason that the politicians the head of the Department for Culture, Arts and Leisure in Belfast wants engagement is because they want to see people coming into the city centre and engaging in the political process. That's what they want. And so when they say engagement, they mean something different from what I mean or you mean or what an artist might mean. They have a very highly political view, and therefore, if they are passing down the street and looking at a dance workshop with lots of people dancing around, they say, great, look at them all moving around, that's engagement. But if they look into a gallery and see 3 people staring at, and they say this, staring, they say just staring, gazing at something, they don't regard that as being engaged, because they think that it's political engagement, and they think people should be talking, or they should be somehow in some sort of dialogue or experience some sort of journey that will transform them, so that when they come out of that gallery, they're going to be transformed into a person with agency who's going to go off and become part of a politic, which actually the reason they're doing that is because they're not very good politicians, and they can't do that on their own. They can't engage people, and so they've kind of passed the job along the line. And I think it's why it's a very dangerous word, which I think probably should be banned, because it does give a sense that if you're not actively doing something and talking and being active, that somehow you're passive, and the audience therefore becomes passive thing.
It's true, but that's why I said there's always got to be a balance of the qualitative and quantitative. So it is important that you get people in, and that people, the gallery is constantly full of people staring at stuff, and I think that's fine. But it's also about, I had a conversation with an artist last week who he just mentioned the word timid, and it made me think of one of the questions around this conversation. And he said too many people do play it safe, they're timid, and they don't take responsibility. And I think that's sort of at the heart of it. So museums need to take responsibility. What is their engagement strategy? Who are they trying to reach? What are they trying to do? And they need to communicate that, politically to the funders, of course, you have to. So there is a certain thing where I think that, you can throw it back on the museums. They have to take responsibility. They have to not play it safe. They have to be pushed to do various things, or to explore, or to just justify their existence. I think, I'm fine with that as well. I spend a lot of time justifying my existence. I think that's fine. It's part of the parcel. I have an important job. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot of people involved. It's fine. We'll take that, and whether that ends up in report writing or presentations or justifications of some of the methods through research, that's fine.
I'd just like to ask the question what you think engagement is.
Well, it is enormously difficult. I mean, I think it is. I think it is possible to talk about engagement, but engagement may work on lots of different levels. I mean, I did some research myself about 6 or 7 years ago, and we came up with about 6 different categories by which you might be able to get a sense of how people were engaging. And I remember, for example, because we talked to people before, after, and several months later, and for some people we went back to talk with them a year after their particular visit, their particular experience in the museum. And it could vary from people who were so excited by what they'd seen, what they'd experienced, and what they thought they learned that they just had to talk and talk and talk. And we set up focus groups and so on and so forth. But there were other people who, a year later, were just beginning to feel they could talk about the experience that they had. And the last thing they wanted to do was to have a conversation, especially a structured conversation, with a museum curator as soon as they came out of the exhibition or the event. They just wanted to go away and have a quiet cup of coffee and think about it, because what they'd seen had actually been very moving. So I think what you've been saying about the variety of responses that you can get, some of them are very personal and very reflective and very quiet, and others are going to be, some people who...
I don't think they're all positive. They should be negative as well. Like,
well, absolutely. But what people, certainly memory came into it, and what was interesting is that anything that was in any way interactive, people would remember 12 months later with real vividness. But it didn't necessarily mean that they enjoyed it. I mean, even something... Absolutely. I mean, it could be a very negative experience, and they would remember that 12 months later.
When it's like dress up as something, you're like, not going to
Can I just ask, is it a good thing? I mean, we're all saying here, this is great that someone remembers a really negative experience where the museum insisted that they were in dialogue with them. Is that necessarily a good thing? I mean, as someone who also goes to museums and art galleries, sometimes it's really nice just to be left alone and to not have someone come and sort of, grab you and say, I want to be in dialogue with you, talk to me. You do get this feeling
not about someone doing that. No, but the artwork can do that.
No, but I mean the displays sometimes do it. Not actually a physical person, but you do feel, who am I looking at here? Am I looking at the museum or the gallery? Are they talking to me? Or am I looking at where's the artist here? Where's the work? Where's the object or the object of interest? Why am I being sort of sidetracked into having some kind of engagement with someone that I didn't actually come to see? I didn't even know they were there. And you do sometimes feel as though as you go in the door, you are crowded in on. And I mean, the Titanic Museum is a very...
Sounds like going shopping.
Yes, exactly. And what about a quiet space where you just go in and you don't have any other... Maybe it's a very solitary experience. Is there room for that?
Yeah, completely. I think it's just having... everyone just experiences art and things differently, so it's having a range of opportunities for them to either get really engaged and talk about it or not, but or just to go in and look at it and experience it. I actually like to do it on my own. I never take the headphones, I hate them, and for most big biennials I just run around on my own. I find it quite slower, and if there's too many people with me I just like to go around and have a look at everything. But it's that I respect there's all the different kinds. Also, I quite like an artist tour. I think that's often missing. It can be the curator, but I like to hear directly from the artist as well. Yeah. I'm a bit spoiled, I guess, there, because I get to talk to them.
As a consumer of arts or galleries, you sometimes want different things, and I think it's up to you as a user to choose that. Sometimes I will go in and I will sit and stare at one picture for 20 minutes. Other times I'll run around an entire exhibition in half an hour, barely really soaking it in, just taking everything in. Other times I'll pick up a headset and listen to something at the Imperial War Museum telling the story of a guy who'd gone off to the First World War and how Vesta Tilly had kind of been, and I wanted to listen to that, and I like the fact that now you can do all of those different things.
Well, you might want to spend a whole day at an academic conference on the subject of the exhibition and get into loads of detail on it. But you don't have to, obviously, go to that.
I did an art history degree. Sometimes I want to read the narrative. Sometimes I want to know the socio-historical context. Other times I just want to have beauty wash over me and look at a gorgeous pre-Raphaelite, masterpiece.
And perhaps that comes back to your question, actually, how you set up this discussion from Susie is whether or not you should have more information when you started on your track to your public objects. The fact is that you could perhaps build more around it, have a more rounded experience, because we've become so much more aware how to choose your experience, choose your entertainment, choose what art you consume, choose what news you listen to. In terms of engagement, I guess it comes back also to you. How do you want to engage? Not also how you want to see people engage with you, right? So taking from some of your questions and your questions to sort of bring that together a bit, it sounds like that the art here in your mills, it would be really fantastic to go, oh, who did this, and maybe have just a name. Because if you are engaged, you may go home to search for that artist and find out more. Therefore, you may know, oh my gosh, on Saturday there's a talk about the art in its context, its historical relevance perhaps,
I'm going to go on it. So you engage again. And maybe that's perhaps what is happening, which is kind of maybe a bit strange to us, that we also as consumers of art actually do also have choice and responsibility to go, you know what, I'm going to come here tonight and talk to you guys, and really, this is of interest to me. I want to know who's that artist who did the knitting, because I've been for walks around here, did some of this work. Who are they? And so that is, again, what Sarah brought up, the responsibility of a two-way engagement, that actually there is no recipe, but perhaps what there is that the curator's responsibility, or even project manager, or the person setting something up, just simply an artist maybe wanting to bring a group of artists together, is that you allow many channels to be open. And that's really unique to today's experience of art, as opposed to maybe 40, 50 years ago, where we didn't have these channels. That engagement can happen on so many levels, that also us as art lovers and wanting something, that we are allowed to engage because these channels are open to us. So it's just a sort of query back.
Completely. For me, I think the whole process of engagement that translates to interactivity at museums is the thing that irritates me the most, really puts me off museums, but is an expression for me of curators, or perhaps not curators, but those institutions denigrating the role of curation based on the idea that you shouldn't really expect too much from the audience. And there is that real kind of one-sidedness that curators know best and they're very clever, and when you actually meet them and have them talk about the thing that they're curating, brilliant. But you never nowadays get to meet them, and often not even through the exhibitions do you glimpse into what's inside their head. You get a real press this, press that. The worst example that really wound me up no end is the football museum in Manchester, where it is like
That's a great example.
It's like a nursery school. It is so awful, but that kind of translates to a really degraded view of the audience.
Why is it awful? I've not been. No, why? What's wrong?
Because
to you at least. Why?
Yeah.
Because it's really interesting. Actually.
Because it's press button. Who's your favourite footballer and all this.
Who won the World Cup?
Yeah, it's absolutely pointless. It's like a school playground.
I mean, is there a it's interesting because there's sort of two ways of looking at this. One was sort of saying that the curator isn't doing enough or have been sidelined, and on the other hand, things are being kind of over-curated in a way, because the experience of going to a museum or a gallery, I think what you're saying, Simon, is quite true, that there is actually, it isn't a sort of difficult thing to do. It's not that difficult, and it doesn't necessarily need to be micromanaged to such a way that people definitely always have a great experience. Sometimes you might go and you don't even enjoy it. That's fine. But I think there's this kind of anxiety that you've kind of got, you've got to kind of, and words like choreograph and journey suggests that you're in a sort of airport security zone or something where everyone's watching you go through and checking, they're engaged, what level of engagement have we got now, and so on. And, hello, just back off, because if you're just visiting something or doing anything in life, you have your friends, you have your own life and your own knowledge and your own agency, and you can just do it. And I think that the problem is that maybe it has been made an over-technical thing, and that there's a whole lot of expertise now at work to make sure that everyone who visits a museum or a gallery gets some kind of experience, which, they can just get for themselves, because people are very good at doing that, at telling stories to each other and making their own lives work without expert advice from... do we need life curators now to sort of help us?
Oh, you can get them.
I just want to say, people pay $1 for that.
research, and it's kind of gone and distorted it. But basically, the point it makes...
How did it distort?
Something got deleted. But basically it makes a piece of research in France on the technology in the Louvre Museum and Georges Pompidou Centre. On average, the children interacted with 9 out of 64% of the technological, facilities, and only looked at 29% of the artworks that technology was supposed to be introducing them to. So I think one of the problems is that there's an expectation, especially when funding is a problem. There's almost like there's almost like this idea that technology will provide an answer that actually has shown not to provide, and so we need to be. I think museums need to be very much more kind of self-critical and look much more carefully at their investment in technology. I'm sorry, but I think they need to look very carefully at that, because I think a lot of money has been spent and wasted on that kind of thing. But I think what that also reflects is the idea that somehow museums should be, well, it's respecting the Arts Council thing, isn't it, and what used to be the MLA, that for everyone should love museums. And actually why? I mean, to me that's a very, very self-serving ambition. I think basically it's about promoting a certain set of institutions as if they should be part of everybody's lives. And to be
like football in this country.
Yeah, like football or something. It's like this idea that somehow, we've got to, it's almost like we've got to survive, so we've got to get the public in there, and then you dance all kinds of dances in order to get the public in there. And actually, you lose your integrity in that thing. And I think what you're, saying in terms of your job is that you're fighting all the time for a certain sense of your, maintaining integrity in the curatorial role. And I'm sure a lot of curators do. But I think the squeeze is so much on organisationally to get the public in and to be part of everybody's lives. Museums should be part of everybody's lives. That it has created a really major problem for museums. I wish, in a way, that at an institutional level, they were more, there was a way of making them more critical, self-critical in that sense, or challenging them in that way. That, in a way, curators' careers increasingly are built on the fact of being successful in museums. And there's a kind of a process that goes on where the successful curators are the ones that do most for kind of a public engagement, but that public engagement is the kind of false flag, if you like, that people kind of aim for.
What I definitely meant is I was a willing freedom fighter for the cause. I don't feel like I'm under pressure of fighting. I'm fighting to make experiences that people want to be a part of and audiences want to enjoy, and make work with artists that pushes boundaries and reaches new places. So I didn't want to give the impression that I'm overwhelmed by bureaucracy or fighting against something, more like a kind of willing fighter to find ways through and to keep going and to research and explore methods of contemporary curating that I actually think are really exciting, particularly some of the youngsters that graduated from the Royal College of Art recently. Some of the work that they've done is really interesting, and how this sort of new generation of curators are very kind of, quite young and diverse, but are really shaking up some areas of contemporary art, and maybe that's something we can learn from in museums. But it's not to say, again, that there's old or new methods. I just think there are some, bad curators who just don't get the balance, or bad kind of museum committees who decide the kind of mixture of technology and narrative and choreography and whatever it is, and art objects. And the balance just doesn't work. But of course it's not going to work every time as well. You've got to try stuff and continually assess it and think of new ways if it's not working.
As I think you're all kind of involved in arts and very sensitive to the funding issue, how do you best protect yourself or insulate yourself to the demands of funders? Because the Institute of Ideas also organised the Debate and Matters competition, and I saw a competition that Corner House have run for attracting new writers around the Shakespeare play, and then the best writer then becomes a reviewer and what have you. And I can see there's a really genuine, rich reaching out to a new audience and a young audience at a bright intellectual level rather than bums on seats kind of level. And the Debate and Matters competition, I thought, God, it'd be great if we could get that into the corner house, well, I fund them as a taxpayer, I should be able to have some sort of influence. And you think, no, it's an art institution. They should operate under their own kind of auspices. But I'm not directly paying the wages.
Well, you pay for the NHS, you kind of
Sure.
get appointments. Right?
But there are there's politicians or art funders who more directly sign off the cheque, and they have their own kind of agenda of, well, we really think, for you to get funding in the future, you should do this, that, and the other. How do you kind of best insulate yourself from that type of broader social agenda pressure?
Yeah, I mean, just back to what I was saying about strength of strategy, vision, but also having evidence for delivering it successfully and well, which I think we all sort of know in a sense which institutions are maybe like caving in or, haven't kept up to date, aren't operating effectively. And there's also, there's a huge variety of things, whether it's fiscal responsibility or curation. If you're not doing things curatorially, you're losing audiences, you're not getting any press, there's a kind of bad atmosphere. So I think it's that strength of vision, conviction, and just taking responsibility, but also admitting when it doesn't work. Not everything works. You do have to have an element of risk. Perhaps I'm more at the forefront of this in a very contemporary setting, but you should still be able to have that space to try things out, and that can help other people. And actually, a lot of funding bodies or whoever are not that. They don't mind so much if you're honest about what didn't work, because then, other people can learn from it and things can carry on. Or if it is dangerous, then you may have to spin it a little.
I think that often people do sort of overemphasise the pressure of the funders and sort of say, oh, well, we've got
because they're playing it safe.
Because, and it is. It's a great refuge, really, for people who, or organisations that want to sort of pop out a bit of taking responsibility, is to blame the funder. Because, I think, in my experience, most funders will set a broad agenda, and people make decisions within that very broad agenda about what they want to do. I think, therefore, that the decision, say, to do one thing and not another is actually the decision that we all take. And so we have to take responsibility for that and not sort of pass that buck up the line to, well, it was the policy or this document or the funder made me do it and I didn't want to do it. And I think that, actually interpreting what those words mean, because when we're using, back to engagement, but words like that, actually having a very clear sense of what you mean by it when you use it, it's really important to actually sort of have definitions of things and to understand. We're speaking the same language, but we might be saying completely different things. So I think that the funder is often, the sort of the blame. They take the blame for decisions that are actually made within institutions. But this question of how you engage with the public in the decision-making process, which is kind of the next level, because there's this whole sort of argument that you actually bring people in, you bring the community into the organisation, and you were saying, well, I want my exhibition on in your gallery, why is my exhibition not good enough to come in here, or you don't let communities in here, and how do you actually negotiate that with and keep control and make editorial and curatorial decisions that you have to make in order to programme effectively, and who shouts the loudest, who gets in which, because everyone can't get in, there has to be some decision making, and someone at some stage has to say no. Who do you say no to? Who do you say yes to? And on what are those terms? Is it clear? I think these are really important.
Did you want to comment on those? Any final points and questions? Stuff that didn't get raised that really should.
I'll just give you an example of the way in which one visit to a museum can be so different from day to day. I visited the battlefield of Culloden Field years and years ago, but I was there the day before the referendum, and you could see that there were people there sort of looking in detail at all because they tell the government story and the Jacobite story before you actually go out of the museum into the battlefield. And I was certainly thinking about the referendum, and I'm sure an awful lot of people were there looking for clues as to Scottish identity and how you unpick that. And I mean, if you ever get a chance to go, it's a terrific, I mean, it's a wonderful piece of interpretation. But it seemed to be supercharged on that particular day. And I think that's great. I mean, I think, museums can provide you with lots of ammunition. But the great thing about that exhibition is that you can follow two lines. You can follow, if you like, the government story, and you can follow the Jacobite story, and you can cross over from one to the other. And it does generate a lot of thinking and conversations, which is great.
Great point, because I think that, I was actually in Edinburgh the day after, and I went into the National Museum of Scotland the day after the referendum, and everything you're saying is so true. It just came to life, because it was real.
Engagement.
Yeah, it was engagement. The engagement did not come from the institution. It came from the streets. It came from the people of Scotland who were debating this issue. So the politics actually was out there, and it illuminated what was in the museum. The museum didn't have to do anything, and that's kind of the way I like it. The politics, when it's vibrant and active out there, you bring that with you.
Which actually answers your question for this evening to some degree, which unfortunately means you're responsible for making things happen. And you already did.
Brings in zeitgeist, which I think is also really important for good curating. What are the opportunities? Why is someone planned something at the V&A at this moment, or in Scotland, or about Scotland?
Is it the right time for now, for that moment to? Yeah, absolutely. So, what in terms of your first question, setting up this, really, really exciting discussion this evening, what do you take? What is it that you think answers some of your questions, or provides maybe a little bit of a sort of a bedding for the question that you had?
The one thing that I would like to see change is that curatorial role being forefront around exhibitions. So curated tours and curated talks, there should be a lot more of that, and allow curators skills and knowledge to come flying out of organisations and to help bring to life the exhibitions. There is then, which is a lot more difficult, a lot of responsibility on us to prepare ourselves and demand more, and not just from a kind of technical expression of it, but demand more behind the scenes from institutions. That's a very difficult thing to think through, how you bring it about in any other way than a technical form-filling, I demand my rights.
Tell them but also I tell the audiences try harder. I know when they're not trying very hard to understand or thinking about it, and I do it myself, whip round somewhere, but I don't blame the exhibition. Sometimes I think I didn't try very hard to engage or understand either, so we call it the try harder.
Or simply organise, again, looking maybe from grassroots up, if you feel like some of your needs as both a consumer and also maybe someone who organises something you feel like it's just not being met, you invite someone through your network to do a guided tour to hear their interpretation maybe of this particular event happening in New Mills, because the more you will do to bring people in, to bring their stories, context, criticisms, oppositions, politics perhaps into a space, the more the other institution will go, well, why are you doing this? Hang on a minute, we should be doing this. So, those things don't need to sit in opposition necessarily, but because you are active and engaged as an audience, you can probably create quite a lot of waves to maybe some of those higher echelons sitting up there to go, hang on a minute, we should be taking control, which is a really great active way to be part of that conversation.
And also, it might not always be the curator that has to talk. There are other ways of doing it, and not every curator maybe is so good at presenting or performing. But, you know, and we've also done it. We've had like Harry Hill do a tour of the exhibition.
That was very good, actually.
So there's different ways of doing it for different audiences. It's just that, you know, freeing yourself up, not being afraid, thinking outside the box for those things, and asking audiences what they want.
But I think the bottom line, or underpinning all of that, is the fact that, you know, you can be confident that an exhibition or an event or whatever, but let's talk about an exhibition particularly, is founded on a really deep level of knowledge, and that you know, you can trust that as a visitor. And I suppose one of the things that tends to happen with this idea of, community participation and bringing in your own objects and setting up, communities setting up exhibitions for themselves and things like that, is that you kind of undermine that kind of thing. And it ends up not being about, the collection of materials that have a history to them that has been
That's true.
developed and authorised in a sort of like a historical discourse and debate. But suddenly this sort of like the personal becomes more important. And I think that does happen a lot, the emphasis on the kind of the personal and the person, that kind of very, I don't know if individualistic, it's a sort of like, it is just the kind of the emotions, the feelings, of the experience of the person being suddenly more important than anything else. I think that is something that a lot of museum education is guilty of making happen. And I think that is, that while that might be a legitimate way of engaging children, I think it becomes really problematic when you extend that into the whole work of what a museum is trying to do, which I think some museums definitely are guilty of. And what worries me is the angle that Museums Association is promoting.
Well, plenty to think about, and it'll certainly get me thinking for the next year or so as I think through a return visit to this subject. But I'd just like to thank Wendy for coming from London, Pauline from Liverpool, and Sarah from Manchester-ish. Thank you.
Great evening. Thank you.